Joining me on the lounge is Ronél Smit, a consultant to parents of gifted children. Originally an occupational therapist, she ventured into the complex and fascinating world of the uniqueness of gifted children and their families. She currently homeschools her 5 kids, runs a weekly enrichment program for gifted children, consults parents, and is a registered SING model parent group facilitator. She is passionate about helping people to better understand how to let gifted children flourish. Renelle, what does the term gifted child mean?
There are a variety of opinions and perceptions about giftedness and what it means. So the word means different things for different people. But in the context of parenting, I have found that the most helpful way of looking at giftedness is from a developmental perspective. So a developmental view of giftedness holds that a gifted child has a different developmental profile. So there are a number of different facets that make up this profile. And the first one that parents usually become aware of is areas of advanced development that they see in their child. So for instance, you'll have a mom and toddler outing, and the mother will see that her 2-year-old child is speaking in full and complex sentences already, and notice that the other kids of the same age are only starting to put words together. And so these are the type of advanced development that parents start to notice in a gifted child. But this advanced development is just one facet of this gifted profile. So I'm going to show you a slide to better explain the different facets that make up giftedness. So the definition that I prefer to work with says that giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different from the norm. This is a mouthful. It also says, you can see there to the right, this asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. So let's quickly look at these different components. The first one is asynchronous development. And this is a term that are used to describe an unevenness in the different areas of human development. So this means that a child may be, for example, 3 years ahead in their reading ability. They may be 2 years ahead in their maths ability, but a year or two behind in their writing ability. So you will recognize that we are looking from a developmental perspective when we describe it this way. But we are also learning that we can't only focus on the advanced development part, because there are areas in gifted children that may be on age-appropriate development or underage development. And so it's better to see it as an asynchronous development, which means it's not in sync. And that helps us to, if we realize that this is part of the package of giftedness, that we may have kids who are clever and excel in certain areas, but struggle in other areas. Then if we look at the second component, it says advanced cognitive abilities. And this is where our more traditional definitions of giftedness comes in, where people think of a gifted person often as someone with a high IQ or someone who is very intellectual. So this is part of the picture of giftedness, the profile of giftedness, but it's not the only part. The next block you will see there is heightened intensity. With these kids, everything often seems to be just more intense, more curious, intensely focused or super not focused, extremely upset, intensely excited. The list goes on. So often when I talk to parents, this is one of the first things that I hear. I am exhausted, my child is just so intense. And it's important to realize that this often is part of the package when we talk about giftedness. Then in the bottom, you will see it says qualitatively different from the norm. This was quite a mind shift for me personally in my own perception of giftedness. Although I am gifted myself and I grew up with feelings of sometimes not fitting in, sometimes being misunderstood, or people saying that I'm living on my own planet, I could never express that giftedness in a proper way. and realizing that giftedness is not a quantitative difference. It's not just more of the same, but it's actually different, was a huge relief for me, and it helped me understand that I'm perfectly normal within the gifted context. So I'd also like to mention here that there are a lot of interesting neurological research going on at the moment around the topic of giftedness. And they are finding a variety of differences, both in the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology of gifted people. So from a neurological perspective, there are significant differences in the hardwiring of the brain of gifted people. And so we talk about this as a neurodiverse population, indicating that there's significant differences from the neurotypical population. So that's just a side comment, but an interesting one. So, and lastly, with our definition to the right, it says that asynchronous development increases with higher intellectual capacity. It is easiest to explain this by thinking about two children who both, for example, started reading early. The first child started reading words and simple sentences at the age of 4, and by age 5, she's reading second grade readers. The gap or asynchrony between her ability on the one hand and her age is moderate, and it can be managed with some efforts from parents or teachers. If you have a second child that was reading the second grade readers at age 4, and by age 5 has progressed so quickly that she's reading Chronicles of Narnia or The Hobbit, this child has a vast gap between her ability and her age. And so the challenges brought on by such asynchrony is sizable, and you need a significantly modified approach to parenting and schooling a child like that. I also want to mention on a personal level, when we talk about giftedness as a term, that I think it's very unfortunate that the term gifted is the term that became the accepted and widely used word, because it may easily sound like a better than you, or I have something that you don't have. Whereas I hope you can see from what I've just explained that it's not a I am better than thou, it is just a different way of development. And it's a fact, like some people have blue eyes and some people have brown eyes.
You've mentioned particulars that show that a child could be gifted. How would I know my child is gifted, or how would it be identified that my child is gifted?
I mostly see two ways that people get to the realization that their child is gifted. The first one is often parents with children who are in school, and they show varying characteristics that puzzle the teacher and the parent. So sometimes the kid seems very smart, and then just the next day they don't hand in their work, or it's incomplete, or they seem not to be able to concentrate. And the parents and the teacher struggle to figure out what is going on with this child, and then they might refer the child to a psychologist for testing. And then often the psychologist report may come back and indicate that the child is gifted. So usually that is by IQ testing, and it may include a number of other testings as well. And the IQ reports usually doesn't give a specific number, but rather a category in which the child falls. So when a report indicates very superior, it definitely means that the child falls in the gifted range. Or even when it says superior with some of the subtests in the very superior range, then many of these kids also fits the gifted profile. So that's one way where parents, get to realize that their child is gifted. The second one is closer to where I started in the beginning, to say that people notice advanced development in their children, and they realize that their kids are different and they do stuff that other kids their age don't do. They have different interests, and they start to try and figure out what is going on. And as they start reading up, they get into the giftedness rabbit hole. So I can quickly go through some of the characteristics and traits that parents can use to understand whether their child might be gifted or not. They seem to be very helpful. Usually when a child fits many of these characteristics, you can rightly assume that the child might be gifted if they fit the profile and the explanations without necessarily having to do an IQ test. So these kids often learn rapidly, and they often don't need a lot of repetition. So they hear something once and they remember it. And they can get very frustrated with mundane tasks or repetition. So you actually often find gifted kids who struggle with their times tables because they just can't handle the having to do it over and over again. They are often described as a good thinker, or they reason well, even if they're very young, and their logic may seem flawed, but they usually can explain their reasoning or logic behind certain ways of thinking. They may be early or avid readers. Many of them have extensive vocabulary, often excellent memories. You often see kids with advanced mathematical abilities. They often surprise you with knowledge that you don't know where they get it from. And they may have unusual interests for their age. Like a friend of mine's daughter, when she was 12 years old, she took to reading her dad's psychology university textbooks. And it lasted for several months. And that was what she wanted to read and what she was interested in. These kids are often keen observers. So they sometimes see or hear or smell or even emotionally feel detail that most people will miss. They have endless questions and an insatiable curiosity. They just keep on and on. The why phase never stops. They may have an extremely long attention span when they are busy with topics of their interest. So it's not always, but when they're, in their area of interest, they just love it. They may be good with jigsaw puzzles and logic puzzles like Sudoku or nanograms. These kids can also be emotionally very sensitive, which is sometimes something that people don't expect, but it's definitely a part of the picture. And they can show deep compassion when they are very young, even though they don't always have the social know-how to express that compassion, but they experience it inside. Also sometimes towards animals and even plants. They may have a need to understand the world and for it to be logical and fair. They often have a great sense of humor and sometimes an interesting and uncommon one. Many of these kids have vivid imaginations, and imaginary friends, for example, has been found to be more common amongst gifted children than neurotypical children. They may sometimes prefer to play with older kids, or they may prefer adult companionship rather than same-aged peers. They may be highly creative. They are very often perfectionistic. They tend to question authority. Their judgment may be mature at times. So not always, again, you can see glimpses of where they have extreme insight in a situation where maybe friends are fighting or whatever, and then just the next moment they'll go fighting with their sister. So they may be morally very sensitive or concerned with this justice and fairness and how the world works. And they often hold themselves and others to very high standards and sometimes unrealistic. So this has been a long list to run through, but I hope it helps to give you a bit of a picture of what these kids look like. And it's also important to remember that they don't have to have all of these characteristics. But if you see many of these in your child, you may strongly suspect that your child is gifted, and it may be worthwhile to find out more about the topic then.
Very nice that you presented it as a tick list. It makes it quite easy. Now, you mentioned that sometimes these children learn very quickly. So does that mean that they find it easy to excel in their area of giftedness?
Yes, sometimes they do, because they have a very, usually in the area that they are gifted, they are very intrinsically motivated. So they would search for and work hard towards that. But there might be other of the characteristics of giftedness that may keep them back, like a fear of failure or perfectionism. Many of the gifted kids have a lack of organizational skills, so that might hold them back. But generally, you will see that they, if they have the right support and the right opportunities, then they will flourish in their area of giftedness.
Now, what are the challenges that gifted children and their parents face?
There are actually quite a lot of challenges that gifted families face, but I want to stick to 3 of them for today that I'll quickly explain. So the first one goes back to the definition that I used in the beginning, and that is the asynchronous development. So having a child or children whose needs and behavior changes across different age ranges throughout the day can be very confusing, and it's very exhausting to a parent because you have to adjust up and down all the time in your parenting strategies and the way you handle your child. So often I find that for parents that is one of the biggest challenges. And also because it's not a well-known concept, people around us don't always understand what is going on with our children. And they may label them as obstinate or undisciplined or lazy just because the mixed picture that they see doesn't make sense to them. So this can lead to parents feeling lonely and isolated. And I have found that just understanding the concept of asynchrony and accepting that this is normal for a gifted child already gives parents a foundation from where they can, build more healthy parenting styles for their gifted child. So that's the first one. The second challenge that I'd like to mention is the intensities that these gifted children experience. So I mentioned that their brains are actually wired differently, and their brains are physically more sensitive for certain stimuli. So a smaller amount of stimulus will create a much larger reaction in their brain. And this plays out in a number of different ways. So there was a Polish psychologist and psychiatrist with the name Dabrowski who described 5 different types of intensities that are found, and they can be found in any person, but they are very common and very extreme in gifted people. So these 5 are intellectual intensity, emotional intensity, imaginational, sensory, and psychomotor or movement. And all 5 of these are sometimes a blessing and sometimes a challenge. So I'm just going to quickly do like 3 or 4 examples to explain why these intensities are challenges. So you can have, for example, a normal birthday party, lots of kids running around playing, there's lots of noise, lots of color and tastes and smells. And a child with a sensory intensity might just be way overwhelmed with all the input, and they can't handle everything that's going on and might end in a meltdown for them. So that's just an example of an everyday life situation that can be challenging. These kids' imaginations often run free and wild, so that can be wonderful for creativity. But the flip side of that is that they can imagine a lot of things that can go wrong. So they might be challenged with all kinds of fears that you need to deal with. Many of these kids also find it very hard to sit still. It is almost as if their overactive brain spills out into an overactive body. So they are at a high risk for being misdiagnosed with ADHD in a school setting. And this is definitely where homeschooling plays an important role. For many of these kids, it's a much better answer. And then they may also struggle to relate to kids the same age as they are because their friends are just not interested in the things that they are interested in. So picture a group of 9-year-old boys running around playing with their Nerf guns. And then the one boy starts a long explanation of weapons in the Second World War and how they differ from today's weapons and how Nerf guns are different from real weapons. And by that time, he's lost his friends. They're just interested in carrying on with the game while his mind is busy with all this background information that's of interest to him, but not to the others. So yeah, these are just a few examples of how these intensities can be challenges in the everyday life of a gifted family. Oh, and then the third type of challenge that I wanted to mention is definitely school. So we have very little in our country in terms of adjustments and support for gifted kids in school. And homeschooling definitely plays a very important role. It's not always possible for all families with gifted children, but often it makes life a bit easier. Just because you have so much more flexibility, you can have the freedom to let the math whiz kid go ahead and he can do his maths on whatever level he wants. And you can also spend more time on the stuff that he struggles with. So different subjects and different topics can be handled at different levels without that being a problem like it would be in a school situation. Also, what I often see with these kids is what I call an input-output discrepancy. And what that means is that the level of input of knowledge and learning that they crave is much higher than what they are able to produce. So they may be a primary school child interested in high school physics, and they are able to listen and to understand and to grab a lot of the concepts, but they're not able to give output of work on a high school level yet. So in homeschooling, we have that flexibility to give them the input on a higher level, but the output that we expect, we can adjust to what they are able to produce at that age. So I find homeschooling a huge relief for many families with gifted children. And especially the flexibility of an eclectic approach works well with these kids.
You've mentioned quite a few things now, but I almost think this next question is a whole topic on its own. How do I support my gifted child? Or is this where we introduce your consulting and tell parents to contact you for more information?
Yeah, parents are very welcome to contact me for more information because, as you say, there's not a quick, unfortunately, tick list that I can give about how to support your gifted child. But the things that you can keep in mind is learn as much as you can about giftedness, because the more you understand what is normal for a gifted child, the more you will know what the next step should be. Also, try to find other families that have gifted children that you can share your journey with. It makes it less lonely, and it's just always good to have discussions with parents in a similar boat. And also help your child find other gifted friends. I've seen gifted kids connect within a wide variety of ages, so you don't even have to try and find friends of a similar age, because it helps the gifted kids also to feel normal. Then it's important to find things that they enjoy, but where they have to put in effort and hard work, because as we mentioned earlier, the areas of giftedness often comes easily to them. And even when they are younger, learning is often pretty effortless. So they don't develop grit and perseverance as naturally as most other kids do. And I find that it helps to find an activities. It may be a musical instrument that they play, or for our one son, it is chess, that he enjoys it, but he has to work hard so that they can learn that putting in effort in order to achieve something. And then these kids often need a lot of emotional support. So we should be aware of not focusing too much on the intellectual stimulation, but balance it with emotional support on the other hand. Yeah, so I think keeping a balance of, on the one hand, challenging them in their strengths, giving them the stimulation, but on the other hand, supporting their areas of challenge, I think is the key to supporting our gifted children. Can I close with a quote?
Yes.
It's a beautiful quote from Dr. Linda Silverman. She's a prominent researcher in the field of giftedness. And I'm going to read it to you. Giftedness is not what you do or how hard you work. It is who you are. You think differently. You experience life intensely. You care about injustice. You seek meaning. You appreciate and strive for the exquisite. You are painfully sensitive. You are extremely complex. You cherish integrity. Your truth-telling has gotten you into trouble. Should 98% of the population find you odd, seek the company of those who love you just the way you are. You are not broken. You do not need to be fixed. You are utterly fascinating. Trust yourself.
So Ronél, how can parents contact you?
So parents are welcome to email me at ronel@altiru.co.za, or they can contact me on my phone 084 979 4779. Unfortunately, I don't have a website yet, but yeah, the easiest way to contact me is on my phone. And parents are welcome to call me or to make an appointment to come and see me for a consultation. I also present workshops and seminars from time to time. So if parents are interested in getting notifications when I do present a workshop, they can also ask just for me to put their phone number on my distribution list. Yeah. And I can also supply lots of other resources, books that you can read, places that you can look. So if you contact me, I can help out with a lot of that.
Ronél, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. I'm sure this is of great assistance to many parents.
Thanks, Anel. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.